Okay, we're live.
Great. Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for spending your afternoon with us. Nate, do we do introductions first, or do we just want to dive right in?
Yeah, we do. Let's do quick introductions.
Okay. Everybody, go around and say hello.
I'm Scott Ainsworth, University of Georgia.
I'm Mike Crespin, University of Oklahoma in the Carl Albert Center.
Matt Grossmann, Michigan State.
And we are Geoff, Lorenz, and Rick Hall of the University of Michigan.
All right, great. So the way we've typically done this is we go around the horn a few times and let people make comments on various parts of the paper. We'll start out doing the general overall framing of the idea, the question. We'll move on to theory, followed by research design, followed by results, and then we'll sort of have another grab bag at the end of overall comments. So I'll generally just go through the role, but you should try to get my attention if you want to do a two-finger interruption or add on to someone's point. I'll keep the cue at this point. So with that, let's get started. And, well, before we get started, is there anything that Geoff and Rick you'd like to say to get us going?
Not me. I'm just third wheel here, so.
Okay.
Not really, other than just thank you for taking the time to read it, and we look forward to the comments that you all have.
All right, well, let's get started then. Mike, why don't you go first?
All right, so we're going to touch on the framing part of the paper. So as I see it, the frame, the thing you want to look at is, are these revolvers better lobbyists? Do I have that right?
Yes. Sorry. That's more or less where we've landed on it. Yeah.
Okay. So I guess my general overall comment with the framing is, make sure you don't slide from are they better lobbyists towards are they just more connected.
Okay.
So I guess that's sort of a big picture. As I read it, I think you're suggesting the more connected is better, but the overall framing tends to slide back and forth between that. And so, yeah, I guess we'll just use it a little bit. Is that how it goes? So I'll pass on to the next person.
Sorry, Matt, would you go ahead?
Yeah, so just to pick up on that, I thought the choice is sort of to either better sell the idea that either communicating with a lot of people or communicating a lot are examples of lobbyist skills or effectiveness, or to the other option would be to sort of tone down the beginning part about reform or concerns with corruption, or are they a better lobbyist? Because I too saw that as at least not right now fully connected to what's measured in the network analysis.
Scott?
Hi. I guess I had a couple comments or concerns related to what Matt said. I'm afraid Mike's comments came through to me kind of garbled, so I'm not quite sure what his concerns were. But I'm wondering if a revolver serves a different purpose than, say, a non-revolver. So there are times when I got the impression that you were talking as much about a portfolio of lobbyists as opposed to a particular lobbyist. So, for instance, for a lobbying effort, one might need a revolver, but you might not need 3 or 4 revolvers. And so I wasn't sure if you were wanting to make this a didactic study, a term that you use from time to time, or if it was really a study of portfolio composition.
Nate?
I have a couple of issues that I want to raise. So one, I guess, is about the big picture sort of framing of, like, the so what question, I guess. And that, the second half of the first sentence of the paper, that, or I should say maybe the whole first half of the paper, but the clause is, that this possibility of revolving door, and anticipating, the question that's in the paragraph, the possibility that the revolving door lobbyists are better, raises fundamental concerns about equality of representation in American politics. But I guess it's not clear to me why that's true, right? So let's say that, revolving door lobbyists are better. Do we think that that's a problem for equality because we think that some people can afford former revolving door lobbyists and some can't? But if that's true, by whatever measure we would measure better lobbyists, can't the more moneyed interests afford those more than non-money? See what I'm saying? Like, it's not clear to me why it's important that from an equity standpoint or representational equity standpoint, it's not clear to me why revolving door lobbyists being better lobbyists itself creates equality concerns. And I'm not saying it doesn't. I'm just saying that I think there's a linkage that needs to be made here in order to sell that bigger picture issue about this sort of revolving door being a better lobbyist, and that's a concern for American government for some reason. I guess I also think that there's a little different toward the end of the introduction, there begins to be a bit of what seems to be sort of a dual personality in the paper between what I thought was initially a comparison. I mean, you start out with this sort of, the question is simple, right? Are they better lobbyists? So it seems like we start by asking a question about whether revolving door and non-revolving door lobbyists are equal or not, right? Are they better or are they not? But then toward the end, there's this discussion, and in particular, I'll point you to the second sentence in the bottom paragraph on page 3. To the extent that revolvers have enhanced legislative acumen and therefore better access to legislators, other lobbyists, including other revolvers, seek them out. So I guess it created some uncertainty, and this could be just purely a wording issue, about whether there's this comparison between revolving and non-revolving, and whether there's some revolving door lobbyists that are better than other revolving door lobbyists, and whether that's part of the frame. So I guess I'd like to see a little more clarity in what exactly I think the paper is trying to do up front in that sense.
Yes, I echo a lot of what was said. When I read the first couple of paragraphs, I expected the paper to be something different than it ended up being. When I got to the end of the first paragraph, you said your question is simple: are revolvers better lobbyists? I was really, and then I saw you had some interview data. I expected page after page of details of things you would learn about how certain lobbyists were better than others at getting certain provisions into this mammoth bill. And then as I go through the paper, I find that the paper is actually somewhat sterile when it comes to how this giant bill was put together. There's almost no discussion of the lobbying process other than who talked to each other, and we get no feeling at all about how this came together, who was pivotal, who was not, how the deals were cut, who got cut out, who got a better deal. And that's fine if that's not the paper you're writing. It just comes across that way on the front end, and that was my overwhelming thought on the beginning. So, Geoff and Rick, do you guys have anything to say about the comments on the framing before we move on to the theory discussion?
So if I can just synthesize for my own benefit, kind of the sort of what everyone kind of said, what I'm hearing, what came up a couple of times is just that the introduction, the way that it's currently worded, especially as sort of a frame for the whole paper, is creating sort of an expectation that the paper then does not go on to fulfill by y'all's reading. And this may be reading too much into it, but it sounds like, you know, the actual analysis that appears in the paper is very targeted, and it's specific to a little bit of how the process on the Affordable Care Act worked. And we should just focus on why that's important and why that ought to be interesting in and of itself. Is sort of the takeaway. Is that accurate? Am I mischaracterizing what people were saying?
Nate, you had a two-finger on that. You're still muted.
I want to add something real quick, and I could also respond. I think maybe clarify a little what at least my perspective on what Geoff said. But the other way in which I felt like there was a missed opportunity in the intro is that ultimately you come down on the side, and like what you're really arguing is that it's not that what everybody assumes, which is that they're better lobbyists because they have more expertise or they have better connections. You argue that they're better at understanding the policy process and the needs of legislators, right?
Yeah.
And that doesn't come across at all in the intro, right? So I mean that came as a bit of a surprise to me when I finally got there, and a happy surprise. I mean, I think it's a really interesting take, but I also think what that means is that there's some sense in which the question you're asking isn't actually so simple as you put it, or isn't the question you're asking, right?
Yeah.
Kind of eventually take it for granted, I think, that that we assume that they're likely to be better lobbyists, or at least that's a premise, I think, of the theoretical setup.
Mm-hmm.
And that what you're really sort of asking is, like, what's the basis, that if we think lobbyists are better, what's the basis for their sort of advantage?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a question that probably would come off as a more nuanced and potentially more interesting contribution. I guess I want to just push back a little on, I guess from my perspective, it's not that I think you should abandon what you're doing in the paper at all, or that you should try to say the paper is something it isn't. I guess what I think is that the intro could do more to reflect what comes later in the paper, and could do more to and could do a little more to sort of answer the so what question, but not that you should sort of say that it's something completely different. Because I think you're in the ballpark on the intro. There are some things that I think you could do differently from my perspective.
Mike?
I forget if it's a two-finger or one-finger, but so you said something about moving the intro towards focusing on the Affordable Care Act. So I wouldn't do that. I agree with Nate. You want to keep this frame broader. So while you use the Affordable Care Act as a test, I wouldn't set up the intro like that, because then all of a sudden your paper becomes very narrow, and it looks like here's how they lobbied on one part of lobbying on one piece of legislation, albeit an important one. So I would shy away from focusing on the legislation and keep it broader, maybe towards what Nate was saying.
Okay.
Matt?
I just wanted to emphasize that I saw a choice. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily give up on the idea that communications is an important part of being a good lobbyist if you wanted to go in that direction. You just didn't sort of do that sale. I saw it as an alternative that you could instead tone it down about whether this paper is really about being a good lobbyist. And then I also wanted to just follow up on, I can't remember who said something about sort of the normative argument that the equality frame wasn't very compelling. I agree, and I think the more compelling concern is that it affects lawmakers before they ever become lobbyists, because they are thinking about what to do afterward, and so that still could be a concern about the same thing that you're investigating. But to me, that's more compelling than some people have better lobbyists than others, and so that's a equality issue.
Scott?
Yeah. Picking up on the good lobbyist issue and some of the other comments here, it seems to me that in the lobbying literature you see people referring to lobbyists as knowing either policy or process, or sometimes personalities. And so those are three very different skill sets, and those different skill sets might imply different things for quality, and those different skill sets might also imply different things for your communication study. And I'm not here to say that you can't work those issues in, but I think they need to be thought about.
Anything else on overall frame?
Yeah, you're puzzled. You seem puzzled.
Well,
Puzzled?
So from the standpoint of, I agree, with Scott with what you said. I think that, there are definitely different kinds of lobbyists, and one of my read on the literature actually is that we aren't currently doing. When I say we, I mean like the entire literature on lobbying.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't do a great job of modeling those differences. Like if you have things that I should go back and read and then use as a basis for incorporating that discussion into the paper, that would be great. And I was actually thinking about that exact issue when I was walking over here to have this. So yeah, any pointers that you want to give on that would be very well appreciated.
So it seems the way Geoff and I have been talking about this is you can imagine there are really three different information networks on and around Capitol Hill. There's the legislator-to-legislator network, there's the lobbyist-to-legislator network, and there's the lobbyist-to-lobbyist network. And that Revolver set at the intersection of two of those. That is, they have a kind of emeritus status in the legislative-to-legislative network, and therefore have more information, are able to engage more, to acquire more political intelligence, and understand the legislative process better. And then the argument is that that makes them more valuable in the interest group network. That and that what Geoff is trying to show in this paper is that they are advantaged. That is their standing with respect to the legislative network improves their position in the interest group network. But so the argument that I see Geoff making in this paper is that revolvers as a class have a comparative advantage in the political information that they can acquire and that legislators value. And that makes them better, more valuable, not only to more other legislators, but to other lobbyists.
Okay. Looks like Mike's back.
Yeah, I gotta try to plug in. You guys with me?
Yeah. So let's shift to the theory discussion now. Mike, are you okay going first again? Mike may have frozen. Matt, would you go ahead while Mike gets back online?
Sure. So I actually thought the experts in Congress argument is a good argument. I saw that as sort of the theoretical contribution of the paper, although I still think we're not directly assessing that. We have no content of the lobbying, so there still needs to be some work done to connect the theory with a little more early in the paper with what we're actually end up assessing. I also thought it would be useful to have a little bit more foreground for the party discussion. Especially what I think is a potentially interesting contribution of the paper, which is that the people who talk to one another do so in partisan networks rather than just the people associated with the majority party having the most contacts. Now, obviously, I already read the empirics, so I got to that theory backwards from you, but it would be useful, I think, to foreground that a little bit, at least as a question, that is a potentially competing narrative that, you know, either the lobbyists that are most effective switch completely when congressional control switches, or that we have, you know, two separate networks, and you come a little bit closer to the two separate networks idea. And then I think the other thing that's missing is kind of what are the alternative theories out there that you are potentially assessing, and or sort of other things that might be associated with revolving door lobbying that might not be the actual revolver status that's causing it. So, you know, you could potentially include other attributes of the lobbyist, like just overall years of experience, business versus advocacy. It looked like to me you had only internal lobbyists. I'm not sure if that's true, but if it's not true, then firm versus external lobbying, firm versus internal. You know, and then it seems like from your other paper that you have some data on their contacts with the Hill, so that could be potentially an internal mechanism for more your theory, that it's the revolvers that have the Hill contacts and therefore get, you know, are better positioned within the interest group network. Obviously, I'm jumping ahead, but any way that you can set up a potentially compelling alternative set of theories or variables that you can compare your results against, that better off.
Okay, Mike, we skipped you on the background, but it seems like you might have a more stable connection now. Do you want to give it a shot?
Sure, yeah. Are we doing theory and hypotheses or just theory?
I just had it as theory, but, you know, whatever you want to do is fine.
Sure. So I missed what others had said, and I guess excuse us anything that's look there. This is sort of outside of my box. What about in the theory though is I think it needs to be more focused. It's a little unclear what exactly your theory is. So you go through a lot of this literature stuff. I would cut out some of the stuff about the iron triangles, and I know you want to get to the issue network part, but I think like to focus things, maybe dropping that might be a little useful. Yeah, you know, it's just unclear what your theory is, other than revolvers are more connected, and I think that's more of your hypothesis. But you know, maybe getting back to where the frame is at the front, like what are you exactly trying to get at? You know, are they better? Are they more effective? I don't know if you could pull that out in the theory a little bit more, rather than just building towards, you know, the revolvers are more connected somehow.
Mm-hmm. Scott?
Yeah, I think Matt raises some really good points about other competing hypotheses and other sorts of attributes that a revolver might have. Lots of folks have noted that executive branch experience is very helpful for lobbyists, and of course the business of lobbying is mostly business lobbying, and that probably needs some sort of recognition or control for. In terms of a more theoretical sort of question, you have a network, and you have kind of one-way edges there, or maybe two-way directed edges. And I'm wondering if you're throwing away information. So in other words, any call to any other individual counts as a connection, but I think there might be a distinction between sending a call and receiving a call, and that might be an important distinction for the sort of analysis that you want to make. So as I understand things, and you have to correct me when I go astray, but as I understand things, you count the number of contacts between two nodes, and then you average them. So if you want to argue that a revolver is more important, then all of a sudden you're averaging the non-revolver's contact with the revolver's contact, and you're diluting, in a sense, the theoretical construct that revolvers play some sort of fundamental role. And so I'm wondering if, by not looking at direction, okay, so we don't have directed edges here, I'm wondering if we're throwing away information. I'm wondering if it matters. It might not matter. I don't know. But does one method fit your argument better than another method? There are lots of different ways to structure graphs, and I think you need to address why you're using this particular structure for the graph.
Yeah, I actually was the one who did the data collection. I interviewed the lobbyists, and what you're really suggesting here is a really good idea that I didn't think of. I mean, what the interviews really gathered was ask the lobbyists to report the number of contacts.
Mm-hmm.
What you're suggesting would have been better to ask something like, how often did you contact them? Well, then we could find out from the other lobbyists how often they can contact that person, so we could get it both.
Exactly.
That's a really good idea. We didn't do that. Yeah. I didn't do that. So we don't have the information to really get at what you're suggesting, Scott, I'm sorry to say.
Yeah.
Had Geoff been involved in the project, earlier, I'm sure I wouldn't have made that mistake.
Well, I know they're not officially directional, but it does seem like you have several instances of two reports, so you don't know how many times each one said they contacted another, but you have two different reports of it. And I actually agree with Scott. It may be useful information. If I say, that I've contacted, that Scott and I talk, 50 times a year, and Scott says that he only talks to me 5 times a year, that might actually be information that Scott's more important. Scott's somebody that people report that they want to see.
Good, yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead, Scott.
I'm not sure of the analogy, Matt, but or the example, but you do capture the gist of what I was trying to get at. I thought maybe that Rick and Jeffrey had the information given the language that they were using, because you do have two separate sets of contacts. So I just thought it was there.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Nate?
So, so as I read through the theory section and then I got to the hypotheses, it's sort of what I see as a real break typifies what I think is the real opportunity, I'll say, for expanding the way we use networks to understand legislative politics. As political scientists, the way we use networks to understand politics and legislative politics, and that is, we have this discussion that's very substantive of lobbyist relationships and some allusions to things like networks, but then we get to these hypotheses, and the hypotheses are stated with terminology of dyads and ties, and there's this, they're evocative of this picture of a theoretical network, but we don't know anything yet about what the network looks like. And what is happened so often when we're looking at what happens so often when we're looking at networks and we're doing network analysis to understand legislatures is that we wait until we get to the data and just presume that whatever measure we're using of a network is sufficient to tell us all we need to know about what the theory of a network is, right? But let me sort of try to invoke the ghost of Nelson Polsby a little bit here. right? If we're going to use networks, we're using sociology, and so we need rules and roles, right? We need to begin by not using the idea of a measure of whatever the particular measure is that we're using, but we have to define what the network means, right? Because it's not in fact a network, right? It's no more a network than any of the things that we describe as in using game theory are a game, right? And so we need to figure out how to really abstract away from this and talk about, what's the structure of the network that we're imposing or assuming theoretically first, and what flows through the network, right? What goes through the dyads, not what's the specific measure we use to measure communication, but theoretically, what's of value there? What can we explain by thinking about this as a network instead of some other conceptualization, right? And so I think, I would really push you hard to try to divorce yourself from the data for a minute and think about, and maybe even look at, some other examples of pure network theory, and try to think about what a network theory of lobbyist activity and revolving door legislators or revolving door lobbyists would look like, without even thinking about how you're going to measure it, or maybe even without thinking about first what hypotheses you expect to get out of it, right? Mm-hmm. We need to know what the particular structure looks like that you have in mind versus some other structure that someone else could imagine for a network of them. And maybe even set up dueling theoretical networks, one that is based on connections and one that's based on some, currency that centers on knowledge of the legislative process. I mean, you see what I mean? There's such an opportunity here to create a theoretical construct first, and then allow the measures to truly just be measures of the things that are in your hypotheses that emanate from your theory. But as it is, it feels very backwards, right? I'm supposed to figure out what your theory of a network is just based on looking at what the measures are that you ultimately use. And really, your hypotheses come from and are worded in the kinds of things that come from the measures that you ultimately settle on, right? But what we want is as close as possible pure abstract theory that is drawn from the real world first, right? So I would push you as hard as I can in that direction.
Mike, did you have a hand up?
Yeah, so in terms of the hypotheses, you can correct me if I'm wrong about sort of how these are then tested. I find it hard to believe like these in some ways won't be true. I think of it like as an square and an adjusted R square. So as you add sort of more people into this network, the probability of connections increases. Is that?
Oh, no, sorry, that's not how it would end up shaping up, right? So the network, the individual actors in the network, at least as we've measured, they already exist, right? So the number of people in the network is fixed regardless. What we're talking about are attributes of the individual people in a network. So a dyad consists of some set of two actors in the network, right, by definition. So those two people exist. So the question is not how many people are being added to the network. The question is, what are the attributes of the people who are in the network? So in this case, what we're saying is, and I can see where you got this, because the language that we use is a little bit unclear. But this isn't like as we add more actors to the network, they're more likely to have a network. It's that as the attributes among two particular people in the network, as a larger number of those two people have this revolver status, the probability that they'll have a tie between them will increase. Does that kind of get at
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm sorry if I'm not totally getting it. Your audio is still breaking up from our end.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Scott.
Just to follow up on Mike's comment. So, do we know whether or not legislators or revolvers are communicating with other revolvers more because they're revolvers, or because they are of they're from the same club? Okay, so there might be attributes of lobbyists that make them very similar. That gives them a common framework to build from. So your lobbyists with executive branch experience might very well call other executive branch lobbyists.
Mm-hmm.
Your lobbyists with business experience might very well call other lobbyists with business experience, because they have some common experiences, some shared experiences. This goes back to the sociology, goes back to the foundation that that Nate was asking for, and it goes back to a point that Matt was raising, which is you need to be thinking about alternative scenarios, alternative explanations, and it could be that we don't have revolvers. I mean, I don't know this. I'm just throwing it out there, right? But it could be that revolvers appear to be more important and more central because you have a fair number of revolvers already in the sample. I think you have more revolvers than non-revolvers. And so like-minded people, or I shouldn't say like-minded, people with similar sets of characteristics are more apt to interact with one another. And you might see, if you were to measure for other attributes, you might see similar behaviors among other sets of lobbyists.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if I made my point clear enough, but if you are a large corporate lobbyist and you're worried about ACA, you might you might be more apt to contact other lobbyists from large corporate interests. If you are from the executive branch or with executive branch experience, you might be apt to contact other lobbyists who you know have executive branch experience because you understand the difficulties of actually implementing.
Yeah, so especially since, you know, homophily is the most common finding in network analysis, you want to say it's not just the revolvers that are more likely to match the revolvers and the unrevolvers match the unrevolvers. You want to distinguish that pattern from the one that you're finding, which is everyone is more likely to want to contact the revolvers.
That's what I was going to ask. So what we show, right, the variable that's actually getting thrown into the regression is not, do they have the same revolver, non-revolver status? It's literally like the number of two people in a dyad who are revolvers.
Exactly. So you need at least one model where you include both to show that it's actually a revolver that does that. And then, you know, I would also think about the same kind of other measures of similarity of background or similarity of position in the ACA debate that you can compare against your variables of interest.
Anything else on the theory hypothesis before we move forward? All right, let's shift into research design / results if we want. Mike, why don't you go ahead?
Sure, hopefully I'll come through here. So this might have come up earlier. It was in your front end of the paper. I would certainly include a measure of time, especially revolvers, time since they were in the Congress or staff or whatever the position was, because you suggest there's some sort of decay function. So this might be interaction. I don't know exactly how you would model that. Mm-hmm. The other thing, sort of came away from this is are there two distinct things going on here that are connected? So do you reach out, and then condition reaching out, do you make lots of contacts with each other? And I don't know if there's a way to model that together. But that's sort of like how I see the big picture of your empirics, and I don't know if that's possible with the network stuff. And there's the other thing I'll say real quick is with Figure 1, and this is more of my thought on networks in general. Either explain it better. I just see I I understand what the different shapes are and the edges, but is there anything do you see anything looking at it? As more of a critique of the social networking figures in general. I'm not sure just by eyeballing if I can find anything there. So yeah, I'll leave it at those few things.
Okay.
Matt, go ahead.
The one thing that I wanted to make sure I say is on the sample. I think the sampling might end up being a big issue for you, so I would spend more time justifying it. So as I understand it, you got an original 125, then you went down to 50, and then you went down to 25 who allowed you to interview them. I'd like to see a table maybe using lobbying disclosure data where you are able to show, here's all the people who reported being involved. The 125 people we found that were reported to be quite involved is a close match with that. And then the 50 that we sampled end up being a close match with the 125, and then the 25 that we were actually able to interview ended up being a close match with those. At least as whatever you can give us, positions on the debate, amount of involvement, something, so that we can sort of justify that sample. Because, especially when you're dealing with a communication network, if you're missing, you happen to just be missing the 5 people that were most connected or most involved, that's really going to change your perception of the network. So, I would include that. I think you don't need as much time as you currently spend on, what the dependent variable modeling strategy should be, and why and which of the generic ergom variables that you include. So if you want to cut down in the space, I would cut down on both of those things. It seems like you're sort of wanting similar to a zero inflated count model, and you don't have access to that, so instead you're both reporting the count model results and the bivariate results, but I think that can be explained pretty quickly without a whole lot of extended discussion. And then the same thing with especially because you don't necessarily, by the end you haven't gotten anything theoretically of a whole lot of importance from those sort of generic ergom variables, so they're basically just controls.
Yeah.
So you spend several pages what we should expect there, and I don't think you don't need those.
Okay.
And then I think I sort of probably have already said this enough, but I would think about your attribute file of your characteristics of these people as being a lot more useful. So if you have anything like position in the ACA debate, previous industry, other kinds of personal characteristics, what type of interest group they're representing, that would I think that would be that'd be useful too. You also shift between kind of saying the group and the lobbyist. So I think that's just a language thing. I do understand that it was the top lobbyist for a group, so the sampling was of groups. But you also might want to think a little bit about the implications of that. Like people were talking about, well, you might have a strategy where your top person is the Hill person, and you have other people that are the issue specialist people, or you have someone who's targeting the House, the Senate, and the administration. So all of that presumes that you have a group of lobbyists and they have different roles, and your analysis is all of the head lobbyist for each group. So anyway, just think a little bit about that, justifying that decision, but also thinking about how it plays into your theory, because you end up essentially assessing what kind of head lobbyist is it most useful to have. And probably for several of these groups, it's their only person, but for some others, it might be one of a very large group.
Yeah, Scott, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just add a brief comment question here. With just 25 lobbyists, and I guess I don't have a sense of this, but we have 16 revolvers and 9 non-revolvers. Is that typical? Or it seems, I don't know, I looked at that, I think that's what, as I counted up the triangles and pentagons, I think that's what I got. But it just seemed like a lot of revolvers.
Yeah. Honestly, every time I show this to a different audience, I get different reactions to that ratio. And it runs the full gamut. Like, you don't have nearly enough revolvers. Everyone's a revolver who's a lobbyist, and then I go the other way too. My personal intuition is that if anything, we maybe are overcounting the number of revolvers that are out there, but I take the point. It's a question, right, of how well our sample reflects the population that we'd like to generalize to, right? And right now, I've heard so many different things about that I don't know that there's I don't know if I believe my own intuition about it, and I also don't know if there's a great way to try to get sort of empirical traction on that question. Mm-hmm. There's some data out there, but I haven't seen people try to use it for that purpose yet. So that seems like kind of its own project.
Right? That doesn't. I don't remember the data very well, but is that the right ratio? Doesn't sound right. I mean, from the full sample, the number of total revolvers I thought was around 50%, which is just about what others, Lapira and Thomas, even pretty close to what Hines et al. Found for the number of revolvers, the proportion of revolvers in the lobbying community. Is that not right? We can look it up, but that's, yeah, we'll
clarify it.
I'll look it up for Geoff, so he can address it.
And Geoff, I know it's not going to be an exact match with the lobbying disclosure data, but I still think it would be useful to collect that so that you would know how many of the total lobbyists who reported lobbying on the ACA were revolvers, how many weren't, all of that. You'll just have the lobbying reports at the organization level, so it won't be an exact match. There'll be problems with it, but I still think it's worth collecting that so you can assess your sample.
Mm-hmm.
Nate, do you have any thoughts on this?
No, I'm holding back. I want to let the discussion go on because I'm looking for a particular thing in the paper. So I'll get back to you.
Okay, well, I'll go ahead and jump in. I'll echo, I think, mostly what Mike and Matt had to say. On Figure 1, this is just a pet peeve of mine. I was always taught that I should be able to read the paper and understand the figure without looking at it. I should be able to read the figure and understand the figure without reading the paper. And I think if you took that figure and handed it to someone who had not read the paper,
right,
they would think you were playing some sort of game with them about what shape do you see in the. Is this another one of those dress games, or I mean, what is that? The triangles and pentagons aren't labeled. That's just a pet peeve of mine. And I do want to echo what Matt had to say about the sampling thing. Do you want to at least demonstrate that? And I think he's also right that you get really bogged down in the details of your network analysis. And I think a lot of that stuff could be moved to an appendix or to a footnote. And the paper, for a while there, I felt like it transitioned into, it became a paper for a methods class, and you're trying to demonstrate that you understand how to do this.
Funny you should mention.
Which is fine. It's just it's fine for what it is. But I think as you try to pitch this to a more general audience, that's going to be less important. I'll leave it there. Nate, are you ready?
Yeah. So I haven't figured out how to make the point, so I'm going to ask the question instead. So the simple version is that both hypotheses imply, the cleanest possible research design would allow us to sort of find some way to be exogenous or random about inserting new revolvers into dyads. And I guess I'm not totally clear on how that happens. So my question is, am I missing this? That there's some attempt to either make the argument that that's happening or deal with the fact that it's not happening, and in particular, right, the concern is that endogeneity in both cases seems potentially problematic. So the kinds of things that the anticipation of maybe so endogeneity may be the wrong allegation. There might be a selection problem here about how they come to be in these dyads. And so I guess I wish I had a suggestion for you, but I admit that I don't totally understand this problem in its entirety. So I guess I'll just simply ask or push you to think about it.
So, okay.
I think it's a really good question.
Yeah.
I mean, and I'll say one more. I mean, the classic kinds of things that we want to, so, we're always trying to find what are the sources of exogeneity, in different things, right? Like we look for instances where legislators die or where state legislators are termed out of office or where, there's some other circumstances. So I've been trying to figure out like what the analog is, right? Like, is there some mechanism that causes a legislator that takes away some of the choice in some instances of that legislator's ability to become a revolving door lobbyist? Maybe changing the law. So like, is there a temporal opportunity to look at one of the some of the changes in laws about legislator lobbying? And obviously the data you have here may not, because there's not such a temporal order to it, it's not an opportunity. But again, I'm trying to divorce myself just for a second from the particulars of the data and particulars of the way the analysis is done, and just even as just an augmentative test, right? That's another way to try to push back on that problem. If you could just get some subset of your data or some other opportunity to make a claim about identification, I think that would make the paper stronger.
So is the issue potentially like, let's say I'm a staffer or I'm a legislator, and I'm trying to decide whether or not I'm going to leave my job to go make a bunch of money being a lobbyist. And so I say to myself, like, okay, well, I know all of these groups out here already. They're already my friends. And so that will make it more likely that I'm a revolver. So in that case, even though the tie, the formation, the specific count of the tie with respect to the Affordable Care Act it comes after the decision to revolve, obviously. If that is also reflecting these previously existing relationships, then we could have a problem where people who become revolvers are selecting into our network effectively because they are contact.
In fact, we would think that we almost certainly think that's the case, right? We precisely think there are different types that select into the network. And I just don't immediately know how to get around that, but it's definitely something that someone's going to raise, right, in the review process. So I would, I don't mean to, you certainly don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's just I would try to figure out how to tactically kind of, I would try to figure out ways to attack that point and take it on very directly, and at least try to say, all right, well, if this is true, what would we expect to see, right? And just try to sort of anticipate some of those potential selection problem allegations.
Mike?
Do any of your revolvers, thinking about their background, this might help a little bit, with better connections, committees they served on, with better connections to the ACA compared to other revolver, but their connections are often totally different?
Yeah, there are a few revolvers in that network who are committee revolvers as opposed to being revolvers from people's personal staff. And then we also have information about whether or not they... and so when we say committee revolvers, we mean like committees that are relevant to healthcare reform.
Sure.
So yes, but out of the 25, I don't think that's a large number of people. That's like probably
2 or 3.
Yeah, maybe.
I think the main things we really know about them are how many years they've served as a lobbyist.
Yeah.
We know, whether they're a revolver, whether a House revolver, a Senate revolver, an executive branch revolver.
Yeah.
We know their partisan affiliation.
Yeah.
And then we know a bunch of attributes about the organization they represent.
Okay.
And their gender.
Scott?
Yeah, I was going to say that if you had the time that they left the Hill, then you might be able to address part of Nate's concern, which is you revolve out because you have a sense that there's going to be more regulation of the pharmaceutical industry, there's going to be more movement on healthcare, there's going to be more stuff going on because of the Obama administration. And so people who revolved out 10 years prior to his administration might not have been able to anticipate ACA.
Yeah, that's a super good, that's a great idea. I like that.
Yeah.
On a different point, I look at Figure 1, and everyone's kind of piling on with Figure 1, and so I guess I'll say a little something there as well. My 25 figure there, I mean, I see 25 nodes with 16 revolvers and only 9 non-revolvers in that sample of interviews. But the other thing that I see there is it looks like everyone's connected to everybody. I'm wondering...
Density is very high, yeah.
Yeah, how many degrees of separation, what's the highest degree of separation that you have in this network? Is it 2, 1?
I don't have that information.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Because it's almost as if we're looking at all the pros, and they're all connected, and maybe we're trying to make a distinction between 25 very well situated lobbyists and very well connected one with another lobbyist. I don't see any. I mean, just as that I don't see a central core or a hollow core, I don't see anybody kind of off on their own, stuck in a lobbying wasteland.
Yeah. And I agree that's almost certainly a function of the fact that the people that we're ending up with are people, or the groups that we're ending up with are groups that are, I would say, generally very prominent sort of healthcare interest groups. And so there are going to be very... Now, that being said, you know, the nice part about our data, right, that would be a really big problem potentially, or it would be an especially big problem if all we had was that, like, dichotomous information about whether they connected to each other or not. And I talked about this a little bit in talking about the specific data, right? So the density of the network is about 0.75, which means that 3/4 of all possible contacts within the network are realized.
Established, yeah.
So it's not to say that, like, everyone is connected to everyone, but just mostly they're connected to most people. The nice part about our analysis, and actually I think the concern that you raised there kind of highlights this, is the fact that we have more fine-grained information about what these ties actually mean. So, you know, as a prominent lobbyist for one group, it's true that, you know, I'm probably going to try to reach out and just sort of touch base with prominent lobbyists of other big groups. But in terms of actually developing, like, sort of a deeper, more frequent communication that you might that we might sort of assume or reasonably imagine reflects a kind of deeper relationship, the number of contacts between them sort of captures that, and unfortunately that single measure of density doesn't give you a good sense of the relative, by itself doesn't give you the sort of the relative strength of these different ties. Trying to remember, I did one version of this where where the threshold for going from tie or no tie was like 50 instead of just 1. Like 50 communications counted as a tie, and everything less than that didn't. And I am trying to remember if I did sort of an analysis. Like it was a much sparser network. Like it was very, you know, there were a ton of isolates, right? There are a ton of groups who aren't having that level of communication with anyone in the network. And there are, but the same sort of, like, when I ran sort of some very preliminary ergums on that. There was sort of a similar set of factors were coming to play at that level.
Yeah, Matt, go ahead.
I was just going to say, wherever you have opportunities to assess your view against alternative views, even if there's not enough variation to include it in the statistical model, I would. So when people were saying, because you could potentially distinguish this experts in Congress view from a pure access view or a sort of information about the issue view, and we talked about one, you have time since Congress, so those should move in opposite directions. For the access view, it should be recency is good. For your view, it should be, spending a long time as a lobbyist afterward should be, if anything, better, or at least as good. Lapira, and they find that the revolving door lobbyists are not issue specialists, so you could show that with general lobbying disclosure data on these lobbyists, say that these are actually people who should actually know less about healthcare because these are people who lobby on more issues than the other people. The more you can use that to kind of distinguish your view from others, even if it's a comparison of 5 people to 3 people, it's still helpful in differentiating your view.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's do one more round and just sort of wrap up concluding comments. Anything you haven't gotten to say yet that you wanted to say? Mike, go ahead.
Sure. I'll just conclude with you've had a lot of suggestions that I think this is great that you're trying to model a network of lobbyists as a network, and so I think there's a lot you can move forward with this. So rather than just look at things one at a time, I think the connection is great. It pushes things forward to think about it this way rather than I don't know, in an earlier or more standard way. So we've had lots of suggestions. That's not to say there's a lot of really good stuff in here. I think that the data are very useful too. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Matt, go ahead.
First, I want to say Figure 1 looks far better than my usual network diagram, so I wanted to say I think probably my bigger point is just think of what the alternative views are and try to give them as much empirical possibility as you can, and then show that yours is a better fit than others. So even to the point of having kind of competing figure ideas, but certainly at least competing ideas either in models or in the empirics, where you can say one story is this is about which side are you on in the overall debate, and those lobbyists are going to communicate with one another, and there are no brokers. That's a sort of another theory of communication. One issue networks theory is it's issue area specialists, the people who are focusing on healthcare. The more you can draw out those alternative possibilities, the more it is what is a fairly straightforward set of findings. Party members are more likely to communicate with one another, and revolving door lobbyists have more overall connections, make them stand out as more important or more useful if they're assessed against some alternatives. A couple of things I didn't get to. Oh, and also the industry, same industry, or more things you can think about in that respect. A couple of things I didn't mention yet. Justifying the Affordable Care Act, there's no long paragraph that sort of is the why we selected this case. I'd like to see that somewhere. I think there's a good story. This is a bill that we didn't know if it was going to pass or not. There was a House version, a Senate version. There was different committees involved. So one needed a lot of expertise in the way that Congress works to make a difference here, even if we were only mainly interested in 2 or 3 specific provisions, as a lobbyist. And I think you can make the case that communication networks are quite important, but this is a case where certainly that should be the case. And I forgot what else I was going to say, so I'll let somebody else go.
Scott?
Sure. couple things. One is, I think it'd be great just to see some basic descriptive statistics. So you have some data from the 25 interviews. You know a little something about who's from committees, who's from personal staff, who's from the executive branch. I had forgotten that you had measures for executive branch. And so some basic descriptive statistics, I think, is always a nice thing for kind of setting up a story. Mm-hmm. The other thing is, Jeffrey, when you were talking about the different thresholds, the 50 contacts, for instance, I think that's fascinating, right? I think there's a difference between, and I don't know how to substantively describe this difference, but I believe there's a difference between Rick and I talking once or twice a year and Rick or I talking with each other 10, 20 times a year. And so looking at those different thresholds, whether it be 50 contacts, 25 contacts, 100 contacts, I think there might be more information in those other network diagrams than you might realize. And so those would be my two concluding comments.
Nate?
Yeah, I guess my overall is that I agree that I think there's a lot of great stuff here, and you know, we have lots of suggestions here today and things that I genuinely think are, you know, hopefully some of them are doable and will make the paper stronger, but you know, I think it's a really good road to go down. I think, you know, the framing things at the front end are actually pretty easy to fix and, you know, make the paper have a lot more punch. You know, the thing I think I would push you the hardest on is to at least take some steps toward thinking about the network as a theoretical thing first, and trying to distill what it is exactly you're getting or you're buying out of thinking of this as a network, as opposed to just a neat way to characterize the data that you have.
Mm-hmm. Just to add on a couple of things. I'd be a little curious to know more about your interview data. I'm assuming that you ask these people when you have them in the interview more than simply how many times they talk to each other. I'd be curious what else you're doing with that and what you learned. I'm wondering if given you know a lot about the lobbying firm and maybe know what they were trying to do, if you see any differences among people who are lobbying for something more narrow versus something more broad. And I'm thinking about the Affordable Care Act. I'm thinking about if I'm lobbying for, you know, the major hospital interest group, I've got lots of risk to this bill. Yeah. If I'm just in the medical device industry, you know, maybe it's a little less deep of my exposure. So I don't know how good your data is on that, but it'd be interesting to explore those things more. But otherwise, I'll echo what the other said. I think you have a lot of good potential here and things that could. Will be that difficult to shape this into something that'll make a nice contribution.
Well, I guess I would say this. Was there someone else who didn't get a chance to wrap up? I didn't want to.
I think we're good. Is anyone else? Oh, go ahead, Matt.
Sorry, I just forgot a couple things. Scott reminded me that in addition to sort of just general descriptive statistics, I just like some sort of here are the differences, overall differences for revolvers versus non-revolvers, so you can sort of set up the ergum before you do it, that, you know, they have more contacts overall, they have a wider variety, they have a higher average set of contacts, you know, something that gives us some expectation that we can then sort of say, okay, we see that working out in the case of specific dyads in the ergum. I would, to the extent possible, I would include at least a little color about how communication between lobbyists might affect the resolution of the bill, even if you don't have it from your interviews, just from news coverage of the Affordable Care Act, how provisions were compromised, how compromises were worked out within the lobbying community, not just between lobbyists and legislators. You know, anything you can tell us along those lines, I think, would more stimulate our interest. And then if you have another variable outside of contacts that is at least another way of getting at power or ability. If you have power perceptions within the survey, or if you have outside data on just money spent, something that we can sort of say our communication ties are associated with these other more common measures of ability or resources or something.
Something like an overall lobbyist expenditure thing, or lobbyist expenditure. Yeah. Well,
wow.
Yeah, really.
This is really cool, you guys.
Yeah, I have like now pages upon pages of notes of stuff that I think will make the paper much better. This was very helpful. Thank you all so much.
Well, thank you guys for contributing.
Thank you. Thanks for being a part of it.
Yeah, this is a great idea. I look forward to hearing about more of these.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're going to do we're hoping to sort of expand the number and the scope in the next year. So we're going to try to, we'll do about 5 or 6 this year, and I think we're going to hope to at least double that maybe next year if we can get enough interest. So please tell people that they should keep an eye out for the call this summer, and if they have papers, put them in.
And you can send we'll get the video posted. You can send it to all your friends and family.
Or go back and pore over it to make sure you get every detail, every nugget of wisdom.
Mike can go back and empirically assess whether he has the most hair or not. I'm not sure.
I don't anymore. That was at the beginning of the call before our 2 guests joined us.
All right. Well, thanks everybody.
Thanks.
Okay.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.